In the late 1970s, California was a landscape of contradictions. Golden sunsets fell on free-spirited beach towns, while the distant hum of the Pacific carried whispers of something darker. It was a time of liberation and danger, when hitchhiking was common and trust was as casual as the California breeze. But behind that sunshine, two men were hunting. They carried a van, a collection of ordinary tools, and a desire so cruel it would change the way America viewed violence forever. This is the story of the Toolbox Killers. A case so brutal, so disturbing, that even seasoned detectives would later call it the darkest chapter of their careers. It all began when two men, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, crossed paths inside a California prison in 1977. On paper, they were just two convicts nearing the end of their sentences. In reality, it was a collision of sadistic minds that would ignite one of the most horrifying killing sprees in U.S. history. Bittaker was older, calculating, emotionless, and methodical. Norris was younger, impulsive, violent, and looking for direction. Together they formed a bond built on shared fantasies of torture and dominance. What began as conversation between cellmates soon became a blueprint for murder. They called it a project. When they were both released in 1979, their plan came to life. They bought a silver GMC cargo van, windowless, plain, unremarkable, the kind that could blend into any California street. They nicknamed it Murder Mac. To anyone else, it looked like a work vehicle. To them, it was a moving torture chamber. They started with practice runs, driving up and down the Pacific Coast Highway, testing out secluded spots in the San Gabriel Mountains. They learned where police patrols ended, where screams couldn't travel, and how to pick their victims, young girls, often hitchhikers or runaways, who trusted too easily. On June 24, 1979, 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer left a church meeting in Redondo Beach and vanished. Her friends thought she'd simply gotten a ride home. But in reality, Bittaker and Norris had lured her into their van. Hours later, her life was brutally taken in the mountains, her body never found. A few weeks later, it happened again. 18-year-old Andrea Hall was hitchhiking along the Pacific coast when she disappeared. Each time, the men grew bolder, more confident, and more deranged. They began documenting their acts, taking photographs, recording sounds, evidence that was never meant to be found, but would one day haunt everyone who heard it. By the time authorities realized a pattern was emerging, the killers were already deep into their spree. Their next victims, Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp, were attacked at a beach in Hermosa. They screamed for help as the van door slammed shut. Passers-by barely noticed. Inside that van for 2 days, the girls were tortured and recorded. Those tapes would later become some of the most disturbing evidence in criminal history, so horrifying that even courtroom staff needed therapy after hearing them. Roy Norris later told investigators that Bittaker treated their victims like specimens, documenting everything. Their pain, their fear, their voices. He called it science. But it was never science. It was pure evil. Their final known victim was 16-year-old Shirley Ledford. It was Halloween night, 1979. She had just finished her shift at a restaurant in Sunland and was hitchhiking home. When a van pulled up beside her, she probably thought she was getting a safe ride. But that decision marked the end of her life, and the beginning of a legal nightmare for California. When the police eventually recovered the tapes and photographs, what they discovered would redefine what counted as cruel and unusual punishment. One detective would later say, "That audio was the sound of pure evil. No movie, no nightmare could come close." For months, the killers had operated freely. It wasn't forensic evidence or surveillance that caught them. It was arrogance. Norris bragged to a former prison friend about what he and Bittaker had done. The friend, horrified, went to the police. Detectives quickly assembled a case linking the missing girls to the suspects. When Norris was arrested, he folded under questioning, giving up every detail: the names, the tools, the recordings, the mountain sites. Bittaker, however, refused to confess. He sat through interrogation cold and smiling, denying everything even as the evidence piled up. In 1981, the state brought charges that would test the limits of the death penalty system. The media dubbed it the Toolbox Murders for the chilling array of hardware the men had used: pliers, ice picks, screwdrivers, hammers. Ordinary tools turned into instruments of terror. In court, the jurors were warned. What they were about to hear, the judge said, could not be unheard. When prosecutors played the tapes of Shirley Ledford's final moments, even veteran officers left the room in tears. One juror fainted. Another later said she couldn't sleep for months. Bittaker was found guilty on all counts: murder, kidnapping, and torture. The judge called him a sadistic killer beyond rehabilitation and sentenced him to death. He would never express remorse. He died in prison decades later, still proclaiming his innocence. Roy Norris, who had cooperated with authorities, was spared the death penalty. Instead, he received 45 years to life. In interviews, he described his partner as the mastermind, a manipulator who fed on fear. But when pressed about his own role, he showed no emotion. He simply said, "I went along with it." He died in prison in 2020. For years, the case of the Toolbox Killers haunted investigators and shaped public policy. It forced lawmakers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some crimes are so sadistic that existing punishment feels inadequate. The details of this case, especially the use of recorded evidence, influenced future sentencing laws for sexual torture and serial homicide. But even with justice served, the legacy of this case remains a scar. For those who heard the tapes, the memories never faded. For the families of the victims, closure was only a word. No sentence could undo what those men did. And yet the story of the Toolbox Killers isn't just about cruelty. It's about the fragility of trust, about how two ordinary men, a machinist and a drifter, could turn everyday tools into symbols of fear. Perhaps the most disturbing part isn't what they did, but how easily they blended in. They looked like anyone. They smiled, joked, bought groceries, and walked among people who never knew what they were capable of. Evil didn't look like a monster. It looked like your neighbor. Even today, decades later, the echoes of their crimes remain. Some of the victims' bodies were never found. Some families still visit the mountains, hoping that one day they might recover what little is left to bury. And the question still lingers. How did two men find each other in a sea of millions and discover a shared darkness so complete, so destructive that it defied understanding? Was it fate or something far worse? Proof that evil doesn't need a reason, only an opportunity? It echoes, through time, through policy, through every frightened parent who tells their child, "Never get into a stranger's car." But in the case of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, that echo was more than a warning. It became a study, a grim autopsy of evil, one that psychologists, criminologists, and even lawmakers still dissect to this day. After their convictions, the world wanted answers. How could two men, not insane, not psychotic in the traditional sense, orchestrate such cruelty with deliberate calm? What drove them to transform hardware store tools into instruments of suffering? The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, newly established at the time, studied the case extensively. They concluded that Bittaker was a textbook sociopath, intelligent, articulate, and devoid of empathy. He viewed pain not as a byproduct of violence, but as its purpose. He once told a prison psychiatrist, "It's not about death. It's about control." Norris, by contrast, fit the profile of a dependent personality, weak-willed, desperate for acceptance, and easily manipulated by stronger personalities. He wasn't the mastermind, but he was the engine that kept the machine running. The two complemented each other, predator and enabler. Their dynamic revealed something profoundly disturbing: the existence of what criminal psychologists later called the lethal partnership. Two people whose moral defects amplify when combined, one leading, one following, both sinking deeper into the abyss. It wasn't madness that fueled them. It was unity, a partnership in darkness. As investigators revisited the evidence, new horrors came to light. Among the recovered photos were unidentified faces, victims who never appeared on any missing persons list. Some experts believe the official number of victims, 5, may be far lower than reality. Even today, there are families who still don't know that the last person to see their daughter alive was sitting behind the wheel of that van. Decades later, search teams returned to the canyons where the Toolbox Killers disposed of their victims. The San Gabriel Mountains had long since changed, rain and erosion burying old sins under layers of soil. But the air there still felt heavy. Detectives, even retired ones, returned not for duty but for closure. They carried shovels, metal detectors, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, they could bring one more girl home they never did. The mountains kept their secrets. When Bittaker died in 2019, he left behind hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, chillingly organized, neatly dated, filled with details about projects and experiments and field observations. Some pages were indecipherable. Others read like scientific reports, stripped of any humanity. He never confessed, never apologized. He wrote until his final days as though cataloging his own descent. Those notebooks remain sealed in FBI archives, inaccessible to the public, not for secrecy, but mercy. Investigators feared that releasing them could inspire others. The Bureau called it psychological contagion, the risk that someone somewhere might see a reflection of themselves in the cold logic of a monster. Roy Norris died a year later, in 2020. His final words were reportedly mundane, asking for water before drifting into silence. No remorse, no enlightenment, just the same emptiness that began it all. But the world they left behind was not the same. The case had forced California and the nation to look directly into the face of depravity and admit that the system wasn't prepared for it. The brutality of their crimes helped push forward several legal reforms, including expanded sentencing for sexual sadism, better profiling methods for serial offenders, and stricter parole procedures for violent criminals. In other words, the Toolbox Killers changed the law not through argument but through terror. Their crimes became the catalyst for a generation of criminal reform. Every measure taken to protect victims' rights, every law written to keep predators locked away longer, carries a shadow of this case behind it. And yet, despite all that, one thing remains unsolved on why. Why did two men out of millions find each other in a prison cafeteria and decide that their purpose was to cause suffering? Why didn't anyone see it coming? Could they have been stopped? Those are the questions that linger, the ones without answers. Detective Paul Bynum, one of the lead investigators on the case, once said that the crimes didn't just break the victims, they broke the people who tried to understand them. The case haunted him so deeply that he later took his own life, leaving behind a note that mentioned the weight of what he'd seen. That's how heavy the Toolbox legacy became. Even those who hunted them couldn't escape their darkness. When you look at the photos of Bittaker and Norris now, they look unremarkable. Two men in plain clothes, eyes dull, expressions calm. That's the most unsettling part. Evil didn't wear a mask. It wore a human face. It walked past you in daylight. It smiled at you while pumping gas. And maybe that's why this story still matters. Not because of what they did, but because of what it reminds us. That monsters don't emerge from nightmares. They emerge from people who stop seeing others as people. For the families who lost daughters, there's no justice that feels complete. Some of them still light candles each year, on the anniversaries of disappearances that never became funerals. Some still visit those mountain roads, laying flowers in silence. The sound of wind through the canyons is the only reply. If you listen closely, it almost sounds like a whisper. Not of the killers, but of the girls. A reminder that sometimes evil doesn't just live and die. It lingers, waiting for the next mind willing to open the same door. And as long as we remember their story, as long as we keep their names alive instead of the monsters, maybe the echo begins to fade, because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose never to forget. The Toolbox Killers are gone now. Their van is rusted, their tools sealed away in evidence rooms, but their shadow stretches still, across every law book, every case study, and every parent's warning whispered before nightfall. Never trust the ordinary, and maybe, just maybe, that's the only justice that remains, the kind that doesn't erase evil but ensures it never hides again. Because somewhere in those mountains, beneath the dust and silence, lie the ghosts of those who never made it home. The story of the Toolbox Killers is not just another entry in America's long catalog of true crime. It's a mirror reflecting the darkest depths of human capability. It exposes how evil can grow quietly, methodically, behind polite smiles and steady voices. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris weren't supernatural monsters. They were men. Ordinary men who chose to become predators, who weaponized curiosity, trust, and innocence itself. Their crimes forced America to change its laws, its policing, and even its psychology. They left behind not only victims, but warning signs, a roadmap for understanding the anatomy of evil. And though justice was technically served, there's no sentence that balances the scales of what they took. Some wounds never heal. Some stories never truly end. The Toolbox Killers showed us that horror doesn't always arrive in the form of chaos. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as normalcy, lurking in the background of everyday life. It's the kind of evil that thrives when we stop paying attention, when we stop listening to the voices that vanish too soon. And so, the real legacy of this case isn't in the death sentences or prison walls. It's in remembrance. It's in vigilance. It's in the understanding that justice isn't only found in courts but in awareness, empathy, and the courage to confront what most would rather forget. Because forgetting is what allows history to repeat. In the end, the Toolbox Killers' story isn't about them. It's about the lives they stole, the pain they left behind, and the laws written in their wake. Their names will fade as they should, but the memory of those they silenced, Lucinda, Andrea, Jackie, Leah, Shirley, will remain the voices that echo long after the monsters are gone. And maybe that's the only kind of justice evil truly fears, to be remembered not for its power, but for its failure to erase the innocent.